We are here to talk to you today about how to eat to save the planet. For those of you that aren't familiar with EcoCaledon, we're a small, I want to say small but mighty environmental group championing climate action here in the town of Caledon. Our food print is the result of everything it takes to get your food from the farm to our plate. So what is the social and environmental impact of our food choices? Well, for one, there's enough food available to feed everybody, yet 790 million people are hungry or undernourished. And I'm sure that that number is even larger now since COVID. So that, I will be honest, that number was taken a couple of years ago, so I'm not even 100% sure what that number is right now. 2 billion people in the world don't have regular access to safe and nutritious food, so that ties into issues of food security. 1/3 of all food produced globally goes to waste. So that's like us going to the grocery store, leaving with 3 bags of groceries and leaving one of them right outside your car, not even bothering to take it home with you, right? So just think about that even from a monetary perspective, right? Like what impact that has on your wallet. And in North America, 58% of all food produced is wasted, generating 193 million tons of greenhouse gases per year. So 58%, and it's not just that 58% is wasted, 63% of the food that is wasted could have been eaten. So it was avoidable food waste. It wasn't just peels and seeds and shells and bones. It was actual edible food. That's why it's so important for us to rethink our relationship with our food. What are food-related climate solutions that we could be exploring? And the nice thing about food-related climate solutions is that they're usually things that we can do as individuals, as households, as a community, right? We don't have to have anybody else make any major decisions for us in order to make these changes in our own life. So the top 3 food-related solutions have to do with how we grow our food. So regenerative agriculture which is just a way of growing the food, like techniques that are less harmful, that actually value the soil that is being used to produce that food and taking care of that soil so that it can continue to grow food, right? Because what a lot of people don't understand is that soil it sequesters so much carbon, so it sucks up so much carbon dioxide that it's actually, helping to fight climate change as well. So the better we take care of the soil, the longer we have it to produce food, and the more it's doing to help combat climate change. The second food-related climate solution is plant-rich diet. So, making that switch from, and it's not something that you have to do everywhere, but just making more of an effort to eat more plant-based proteins or plant foods over animal-based foods, and reducing food waste. So, making sure that we are not putting that avoidable food waste into either our green cart or into the landfill can help as well. And when you look at these, they're very simple actions that we could be taking. We could be making efforts to, choose foods that are grown locally and from farms that are practicing regenerative agriculture. We can make those choices to choose more plant-rich meals. We can make the choice to reduce our food waste. So you can, use a dry erase marker, and you can use that to help you plan your meals for the week. And on the back side, there's actually even 5 tips for helping you with meal planning. Loving your leftovers. It's not just about, taking that leftover for lunch the next day, but look at them as ingredients. How might those leftovers, maybe you can put enough in the freezer, or maybe, you're okay with taking it for lunch the next day, but maybe, there's something that you can do with it later on in the week, right? So I like to make a red lentil chickpea curry that one night we'll eat as a curry over rice, and then later on in the week, if there's only a little bit left, I usually make like a poutine out of it, right? So just being creative with how we're using those leftovers. Learning about best before over expiry dates. That's a huge one for a lot of people. I think a lot of people just, that you hit that best before date and whatever it is goes out into the garbage, when in truth, there's only a handful of items that need to be tossed after their best before date. There's only, believe it's 5 items that have an actual expiry date. That is like meal supplements, nutritional supplements, formula, and things like Ensure. What am I missing? That's about it, right? So it's really only that handful of items that after that date, you should toss them out. The rest, it's more about, that's the best before. That doesn't mean that it's terrible after kind of thing, right? And you'll have actually, one of the other handouts that you have does talk about some of the common food items. Yeah, and if they're close to best before or expiry, you can then, it tells you when you can put them into the freezer, how long they'll last from the freezer. So that'll help extend the life of a lot of the different foods that we're used to, looking at those best before versus expiry dates on. How we store our food, right? So, a lot of times, in the refrigerator, there are spots that are colder or not as cold, and on the backside of that same sheet, you'll actually see an image of a refrigerator that'll tell you specifically what the best places are in the fridge for keeping certain items so that you can prolong the life of those items. And then last but not least, composting, right? So when we do have unavoidable food scraps, or unfortunately something does get to the point where it is unedible, making sure that those items go into your green cart rather than into the landfill is very important. A lot of times, I think people are under the impression that, if it goes to the landfill, it's gonna rot naturally because it's a food item, and that's it, and it'll biodegrade. But the problem is when garbage is piled on top of each other, there's a lack of oxygen. And so without the oxygen, that food can't actually biodegrade. So they've dug up food that's 40 years old. Like they've dug up lettuce from the landfill and it still looks like a head of lettuce, but it's been there for like 40 years, right? And the problem with that too is that food, when it rots, lets off methane gas. And methane gas is actually even a lot more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to the impacts on the planet, right? So please remember, compost when you need to get rid of your food, because that can be turned around. And then in a matter of a couple of months, that compost gets turned around into rich, healthy soil that you can be using in your gardens. I am gonna pass it over to Jason here to do a quick chat around his experience and how he manages to be not only just an athlete, but a triathlete on a plant-rich diet. Here's our success story.
They wanted to figure out, how much of an impact would it have if we actually shifted, and theoretically, of course, because not everybody's gonna go vegan overnight, but let's say everybody adopted, primarily, we'll call it, 95, 98% plant-based diet. If we're eating, the vast majority of our food is from plant-based, what effect could we have? This is the amount of land that we could give back to nature. It's about the size of Africa. That's how much extra land has been deforested, wildlife habitats have been displaced, all of that, just so that we can create the animal protein that we have an appetite for. So if we shifted back to eating, if we shifted to eating more plant-based food, we could then rewild this much land, which would not only create, environments for endangered species to bounce back, it's also going to sequester a ridiculous amount of carbon, right? Because there's been so many trees that have been cut down to create this farmland that if we rewild that land, it would sequester so much carbon. So it's not only reducing the emissions from animal agriculture, but it's also actually creating more carbon sequestration potential there. So this is also because it's so much more efficient, right? It's so much more efficient to just eat the plants directly, as we saw in another slide, right? Like the amount of plant-based food you can create on a piece of land versus the amount of animal protein, there's just no comparison. It's exponential. So, and there was a paper that came out, they were looking at, this is just a year ago, if we were to rapidly phase out, so rapid transition away from animal agriculture to plant-based agriculture, we could actually stabilize greenhouse gas levels for 30 years. Just if we did that like right away, we could do that. And over the century, we would offset 68% of CO2 emissions for the entire century. And that's, again, taking into account all of the sequestration of carbon that would occur if we were to rewild a lot of that land that we would no longer need for agriculture. So this is the potential solution. Is animal protein needed to become one of the top athletes in the world? Well, the fact that all of these athletes are plant-based would tell you that it's not. And these are some of the top athletes in the world. I don't know if anyone can recognize any of these athletes here. A few notable mentions. What's that? Or Novak Djokovic here, right? Other tennis player. But someone we should definitely mention is Megan Duhamel, Canadian figure skater, right? Who's won several Olympic medals for Canada. And she was actually just last weekend, there was Planted Expo, which is a plant-based event that took place in Toronto. She was speaking at. And another notable mention, because many people will say, okay, well, you can do the plant-based diet if you're doing endurance sports or maybe something like this, but if you want to build serious muscle, that's not going to work. Well, what about Patrick Baboumian? He, again, in Toronto back in 2013, he set a world record for the most weight ever carried by a human being. And it's just an insane amount of weight. If you can imagine picking up a grand piano and carrying that across the room, or perhaps picking up an adult horse and carrying the horse across the room, that's the kind of weight this guy's throwing around, and he's done this 100% on a plant-based diet. So yeah, all different kinds of athletes can make it work.
One and only Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I ate a lot of meat. They showed us commercials
Steak. That's what a man eats.
selling that idea that real men eat meat.
Serious man food.
But you got to understand, that's marketing. That's not based on reality.
I've been teaching fighting techniques to government agencies for more than 15 years. Then I got injured. Unable to teach for at least 6 months, I spent more than 1,000 hours studying science on recovery and nutrition, and stumbled across a study about the Roman gladiators.
The gladiators were predominantly vegetarian.
How could the original professional fighters be so powerful, eating only plants?
When I made the switch to a plant-based diet, I qualified for my 3rd Olympic team. I broke 2 American records. I was like, man, I should have done this a long while ago.
When I went plant-based, I wasn't sure if I was gonna survive. And I actually became like a machine.
One of the biggest misconceptions in sports nutrition is that we have to have animal protein to perform at a high level. That's just not true.
Sometimes you have to do things that you know your competitors aren't doing.
Today's blood and yesterday's blood.
Yeah.
I think this is going to wake a lot of people up.
I was recovering better, not getting as sore. This was our best season in the last 15 years, and we had 14 guys on plant-based diets.
We all want to feel great, have more energy.
Cholesterol was 276. Today, 169.
Whoa, now you're talking.
Most guys my age can keep up with the grandchildren. My grandchildren can't keep up with me.
It's not one set of dietary guidelines for improving your performance as an athlete, another one for reversing heart disease, reversing diabetes. It's the same for all of them.
Someone asked me, how could you get as strong as an ox without eating any meat? And my answer was, have you ever seen an ox eating meat?
They actually found that the vegan athletes had higher VO2 max and higher time to exhaustion, so their sub-maximal endurance. And that's really interesting because it totally contradicts the popular belief of people thinking that we need meat to be fit and strong, whereas here we have the vegan athletes who are actually showing higher VO2 max and time sub-maximal endurance, which are really helpful for things like triathlon, which I do. And so when I see this study here, I say, okay, well, that explains it. That explains how I've been able to go from this incredibly, average, athlete into somebody who's able to show up and win races, right? So, because it didn't really make sense to me, but that study helped me kind of figure it out. Usually what I encourage is for people to think about, like, what could you eat for a day? Like, what would be a breakfast, lunch, and dinner that would be entirely plant-based just for the exercise, right? And then I know we're going to look at meal planning and stuff like that. So I'll hand it back over to you, but I'm around if there's any questions or anything. And thank you all so much for listening. Thanks.
A lot of you are actually here today because you saw maybe some information about our new Caledon Cares Enviro Challenge. I'm going to invite John up to the front here to talk about it, but we've got some actions based on today's conversation.
The big things that we're talking about, of course, are the food that we consume and how much food we waste. So thinking of that, we have our first challenge that we're putting out to you guys. This is a whole year-long thing that Eco Caledon has. It's called the Caledon Cares Enviro Challenge. And each set of challenges, starting with food, gives you actions you can do to take, and when you do them, you can let us know, and you have a chance to win prizes, recognition, that kind of stuff. And on here, it has actions you can take. So when you get this, take a look. Turn your dinner into lunch. So that's the first action you could do. So in other words, if you have leftovers, use them for lunch. And we all have that, but quite often we leave them in the back of the fridge. So that's one. You can pick from any of these or all of them if you want to, right? The next one is dedicate a leftovers night. Lou and Jason talked about that, where you just throw everything together and change it up and add things to it. So that's a great opportunity. And then the third one is think ingredients, not leftovers. So start to think about what ingredients you have in the house to make something, rather than have to go out and get more ingredients. And then at the bottom, there's a fourth one, in fact, which is Meatless Mondays, which you can take at. So these are all the actions when you've had a chance to try them. What you can do is, as I said, go to the QR code and enter them. And on our website, there's going to be a link as well, so you can go in there and participate. So take the challenge.